Since I've been making these videos, and really since I decided to give up flying for holidays, one of the most common things I get asked about is carbon offsetting. What about carbon offsetting? If I offset my flight, that cancels out any harm done, right? Surely if you're gonna fly, it's better to offset than do nothing. Don't carbon offsetting projects help tackle climate change? Isn't it a good stepping stone for people who want to travel but are also worried about climate change? Hello, I'm Sarah, and today I'm going to attempt to answer all these questions and more, starting with what even is carbon offsetting. Then I'll share 6 reasons why I don't think carbon offsetting is a very helpful way to tackle the harmful emissions caused by flying, and I'll also offer some suggestions of what we can do instead. But first, just a quick disclaimer to say that this topic can get quite complicated quite quickly. So I'm going to do my best to include as much information here as possible without compromising on accuracy, but please bear in mind that I can't include everything. Also, any opinions I may share on this topic are by no means set in stone. I'm definitely open to changing my perspective if presented with more compelling arguments. But here's what I think with what I know so far. Carbon offsetting works on the assumption that carbon emissions have the same impact on the planet wherever they're emitted and whatever the source. So if a ton of carbon dioxide is emitted in one part of the world, it can be cancelled out by absorbing a ton of carbon dioxide in another. So in theory, companies and individuals can cut or cancel out the impact of their carbon emissions by giving money to projects that reduce or store carbon dioxide. Projects which plant trees or conserve forests, for example, are a popular way to do this. That's because as trees grow, they absorb carbon dioxide from the air and store it. But there are also other projects which can lower emissions, like building solar and wind farms and improving energy efficiency with insulation and switching to cleaner cook stoves. So, if you buy a flight, say from London to Spain, all you need to do is pay an extra £5, for example, to a project in South America which plants trees, and the harm caused by the emissions from that flight are cancelled out, right? Well, not quite, and now I'm going to tell you why. So although the theory behind carbon offsetting may work, in practice it often doesn't. It's actually really difficult to calculate and monitor the exact amount of carbon which is being absorbed and stored by these projects. An EU study, for example, found that 85% of projects under the world's largest carbon offsetting program failed to reduce any emissions at all. And an investigation into the offsetting schemes used by some of the world's largest airlines found them to be based on a flawed and highly criticised system, despite some of these airlines using the schemes to back up claims of carbon-neutral flying. Because it's cheaper to run offsetting schemes in developing countries, most of them are located there. And this can lead to local conflicts or land grabbing and can threaten the rights of indigenous communities. For example, in one case, the Sengwer people of Mbobut Forest in Kenya were violently forced from their ancestral homes as part of a plan to reduce deforestation. They were moved without being consulted or giving consent, which is actually a violation of both Kenyan and international law. Now, I'm not saying that these first 2 points apply to all carbon offsetting schemes. There are a wide variety out there, and some are more credible than others. And that's because the way that they calculate the carbon can differ, as well as the types of projects and also the standards they abide by. A really useful table from the academic Roger Tyers shows just how much offsetting companies differ in their calculations of the emissions created by a flight from London to New York, as well as the cost to offset it. But regardless of their credibility, offsetting schemes usually need land, and simply put, there's not enough of it. Oxfam estimates that the land required to meet the offsetting plans by businesses, including airlines, could amount to 5 times the size of India, which is more than the entire area of farmland on the planet. And then we come back to this issue of much of that land being owned by local or indigenous communities, who in many cases haven't given their consent. And all of these schemes still work on this idea of cancelling out or offsetting carbon, which in itself can be problematic. Even if these projects do work and they manage to plant a load of trees without them being cut down or even burnt down, which by the way has happened in some offsetting cases and is more likely as the world heats up, the timings don't match up. Trees take decades to grow, and during that time the emissions from flying start warming the planet straight away and causing irreversible damage. And yes, although they may be one of the more popular projects, not all carbon offsetting is about trees, but other methods come with their own problems. There are technologies, for example, which can capture and store carbon directly from the air, which are much quicker and would actually address this timing issue, but they're currently quite expensive and hard to scale up. And for offsetting projects which involve building solar and wind or improving energy efficiency, it's difficult to tell that a specific offset actually led to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that wouldn't have happened otherwise. The cost for solar and wind is dropping rapidly, and upgrading energy efficiency has an inherent economic incentive, So a lot of these projects would be going ahead anyway, regardless from the money that they receive from carbon offsetting. Another example of an alternative is destroying industrial gases, some of which are actually more powerful at warming the planet than CO2. But apparently these projects aren't as popular because they don't have the additional social and environmental benefits that other carbon offsetting projects can have. Also, some argue that offsetting really isn't the best way to reduce these types of emissions because it can provide incentives for countries to build new facilities which use these gases to increase revenue from selling offsets. Basically, they're rewarded for destroying gases which shouldn't have been produced in the first place. Also, apparently there's more cost-effective ways to capture and phase out these gases than reducing these emissions through carbon offsets. We now know that the stage we've reached in the climate crisis means it's not enough to leave fossil fuels in the ground and reduce the amount of carbon we emit. We also need to be removing that carbon from the atmosphere. So obviously planting trees and restoring forests is a good thing, but we need to be doing those things as well as cutting emissions, not instead of. Now, some argue that carbon offsetting provides the much needed money to pay for these kinds of projects. But as we've seen, it's hard to know that that money is actually doing what it's supposed to. And some of these projects would be going ahead anyway, regardless of the money received from offsetting. And the whole concept of offsetting rests upon this idea of essentially keeping carbon emissions at the same level. Emit a ton here, absorb a ton there. When we know that's simply not going to cut it if we're going to effectively tackle climate change. So this is where a more ethical argument against offsetting comes in. Some people argue that offsetting gives people and companies a license to pollute. So it basically justifies their polluting behaviors and takes the place of more effective action. At the very least, it begs the question, how often is carbon offsetting taking the place of real long-term solutions? So what should we do? And to bring it back to where we started, if we're going to fly, isn't it better to offset than do nothing? Well, one thing's for sure, we cannot undo the harm caused by emissions from flying. So some suggest that carbon offsetting should be used as a last resort after exhausting all other options to reduce emissions. So in the case of flying, it would be avoiding the flight altogether. And if we're serious about tackling climate change, sometimes that's going to mean asking ourselves some difficult questions. Not all flights are equal. For example, flying to visit family is very different from flying for a holiday. So asking ourselves whether we really need to fly is going to be a part of this, and that's going to be different for everyone. But of course, not everyone can avoid all flights, and it's understandable that the people who really need a flight also want to reduce the harm done by it. So rather than spending money on offsets that don't actually do what they say on the tin, maybe donating to a charity which helps victims of the climate crisis is a better use of money within this context. Or give money to a charity working to tackle the climate crisis. But we can't see that as a way of cancelling out the emissions from flying. Also, I just wanted to add that by no means am I saying that the climate crisis lies solely with individuals. We need huge systemic change if we're going to achieve what's needed. But governments and businesses will only move fast enough once they know the public are on board. I might actually do a video in the future which addresses questions about whether flying less actually makes any difference in the fight against climate change. But otherwise, I really hope this was useful, and if you're interested in more videos about climate change and flying, or seeing what it's like to travel by train rather than plane, I'll link to a few videos below. I'll also leave some links to organisations and charities working to tackle the climate crisis and also helping the victims of it. But otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.